That morning was my daughter's wedding day. I woke up with a strange, restless feeling in my chest, something I couldn't explain. Still, I forced myself to stay calm. Today was supposed to be a beautiful day. Then Martin, my driver, showed up far earlier than usual. He didn't bother with the usual greetings. He just looked straight at me, his face tight like something serious was about to happen. "Don't say a word. Trust me." Before I could even ask what he meant, Martin grabbed my arm, pulled me toward the car, opened the back door, and shoved me inside. I barely had time to react before he pushed me down and threw a blanket over me, like he was hiding contraband. My heart started pounding in the darkness. All I could smell was the leather of the seats and the dusty scent of the blanket pressing against my face. Martin bent down and whispered right next to my ear, "You need to see it with your own eyes. If you say anything now, everything will fall apart." The car door shut with a sharp click, and in that moment, I understood. This was no longer a ride to the church. It was a ride toward the truth. I'm not telling this story just to shock you and have you forget it a minute later. I'm telling it because some betrayals don't come from strangers. They show up on the very day you believe you're the happiest. If you're still watching at this point, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. I want to know how many people out there have been blindsided right in the middle of a moment that was supposed to be the happiest of their lives. Some details in this story are slightly changed to protect the real people involved, but the lesson stays the same. When someone tells you to stay silent and hide, it usually means you're about to witness something that could tear an entire family apart. And after Martin said, "Don't say a word," I understood one thing very clearly. This car wasn't taking me to a wedding. It was taking me to evidence something that, if I had known about sooner, might have stopped my daughter from getting so close to the edge. I'm 62 years old. Today was supposed to be the day I walked my daughter down the aisle, the moment I had imagined ever since she was just a tiny little girl. My wife passed away 5 years ago, and before she left, she held my hand and told me one very simple thing. No matter what happens, you have to protect our daughter. That morning, the house felt strangely quiet. There was no laughter, no joyful wedding music like people always imagine, just a cold emptiness sitting in my chest, the kind of feeling men often try to ignore, because admitting it would make them feel weak. I lay there under the blanket in the back seat, listening to the tires roll over the pavement, wondering what on earth Martin was doing. The man had been driving for my family for nearly 20 years. He had never acted like a criminal. But then I remembered the promise I made to my wife, and suddenly it made sense. If Martin was desperate enough to hide me like this, then my daughter wasn't just facing the risk of a wedding being canceled. She was standing on the edge of something far worse, and I was about to choose between staying silent to keep the peace or learning the truth to save my daughter. Martin drove steadily, but I could hear his breathing short and tight, like someone forcing himself to stay calm. I shifted slightly under the blanket, about to ask a question, when he growled through the gap between the seats. "Don't speak. Don't move." I froze. Martin wasn't the type of man who gave orders. He was the one who had been driving for my family for nearly 20 years. He watched my daughter grow up, watched my wife pass away, watched me struggle to stand back up afterward. Then Martin spoke again, his voice lower now, almost like a confession. "I promised her, your wife, that if the day ever came when I saw something wrong, I wouldn't let you or that girl walk straight into a trap." I swallowed hard. Even in the darkness, hearing my wife mentioned felt like someone pressing a finger right into my chest. Martin turned the wheel slightly, steering the car off the road that led to the church. I could feel it immediately. We were heading somewhere else, not toward flowers or wedding music, toward the truth. And that's when I understood. Martin wasn't hiding me for some joke. He was hiding me to save my life. And maybe my daughter's too. I stayed completely still under the blanket, catching only faint streaks of light through the gap between the seats. Then the car door opened, and a rush of cold air poured in along with the sharp scent of a man's cologne. Zachary slid into the front seat. His voice was cheerful, exactly like the perfect groom people expect on a wedding day. "Morning, Martin. Ready for the big day?" Martin answered calmly, as if nothing at all was wrong. "Yes, sir." I heard Zachary make a phone call almost immediately. His voice turned soft and sweet, dripping like honey. "Babe, I'm on my way. Just breathe, okay? Everything's going to be perfect. I love you." Every word sounded like a vow. But lying there in the dark, it felt less like love and more like a performance he had practiced 100 times. For a moment, doubt crept into my mind. What if Martin had misunderstood something? What if we were overreacting? After all, Zachary had always been polite in front of me. He called me sir, shook my hand firmly, and promised he would take care of my daughter for the rest of his life. But then I heard a small click. Zachary ended the call and let out a completely different kind of breath, colder. And in that moment, I understood something chilling. The man sitting in the front seat might have two faces. Zachary had barely finished the call with my daughter when his phone buzzed again. This time, he didn't sound sweet at all. He answered, like someone snapping back to his real self. His voice dropped sharp and impatient. "No, not yet." I lay under the blanket, but I could hear every word clearly. That tone wasn't meant for a future bride. It was the kind of tone you use with an accomplice or a creditor. He went quiet for a few seconds, listening. Then he said something that sent a cold shiver through me. 3 months. I already told you. Not before that. Not until it's done." His head turned slightly toward the window, like he was checking the road. Martin kept driving steadily, but I could hear the faint sound of his hands tightening around the steering wheel. Zachary continued, irritation creeping into his voice. "Don't make me deal with it early. I need everything to look clean. You understand?" Then he hung up abruptly and let out a heavy breath, like he had just forced something savage back inside himself. I swallowed hard in the darkness, because that phrase 3 months didn't sound like a honeymoon plan. It sounded like a deadline. And I had the terrible feeling that the person scheduled on that timeline wasn't Zachary. Me. The car drove on for a few more minutes, and I could feel it clearly now. We weren't heading toward the church. The road grew rougher, traffic thinned out, and Martin turned into the south side like a man who already knew the route. Zachary looked out the window and spoke like he was giving an order. "Martin, stop by Maple Street first." Martin answered immediately, without a single question. "Yes, sir." And that response sent a chill down my spine. If this had been a sudden request, Martin would have hesitated, but he answered as if that stop had already been part of the plan. Zachary tapped quickly on his phone, sending a message. I heard him mutter under his breath, quiet but sharp. "Almost there. Get ready." Then he leaned back in the seat and let out a long breath, like a man finishing some private business before walking into a church to play the role of the perfect groom. I stayed motionless under the blanket, my heart pounding heavily in my chest, because I understood something now. If Martin was willing to hide me just so I could hear and see this, then Maple Street wasn't a quick stop to buy flowers. It was the place where I was about to see something that would make those words, 3 months, suddenly make sense. The car rolled to a stop in front of a row of old townhouses on Maple Street. Zachary didn't step out right away. He looked around carefully, scanning the street like he was checking for neighbors. Only then did he get out of the car, closing the door softly, so softly it felt practiced. I lifted my eyes slightly through the gap in the blanket and looked out the rear window. On the mailbox in front of the house was a name that made my whole body go still. The Palmer family. I swallowed hard, because Zachary had told my daughter he didn't have a family anymore. He said he had been on his own since he was young. He said she was the only person he had left in the world. But if he had no family, then whose name was on that mailbox? And why was he coming here on the very morning of his wedding like a man returning home? Martin parked the car just far enough away from the door to avoid attention. Zachary walked up the small set of steps and knocked in a rhythm that sounded practiced. Not the knock of a stranger, the knock of someone who had done it many times before. From under the blanket, I felt a cold chill crawl up my back, because Maple Street wasn't a random stop. It was another life Zachary had been living, and the name Palmer family had just opened a door my daughter had never been allowed to see. I was still staring at that mailbox when the front door opened. A woman stepped out first, her hair tied back neatly, a coat thrown on in a hurry. She looked tired, but comfortable in the way someone looks when they've lived in a place for years. The way she looked at Zachary wasn't the way you look at a guest. It was the look of a wife who was tired of having to ask the same question again. "What are you doing here now?" Then a little girl ran out after her, maybe 4 or 5 years old, wearing only socks, her hair messy like she had just rushed outside. She ran straight into Zachary's arms and shouted a single word, clear as a blade cutting through the air. "Daddy!" Zachary bent down and lifted her up, kissing her forehead almost automatically. There was no hesitation, no performance. It was the embrace of a man who had done it many times before, a real father holding his child. Lying under the blanket, my hands went cold, because while my daughter was putting on her wedding dress, believing she was about to marry a man who was all alone in the world, here on Maple Street, Zachary had another family waiting for him, a woman, and a little girl who called him Daddy, like it was the most normal thing in the world. And right then, I knew. The wedding today was about to turn into a nightmare. Standing on the porch, Zachary was close enough that I could hear their conversation clearly. The woman Marley wasn't crying. She didn't scream. She spoke the way someone does when they've been lied to for far too long. "You're really going to marry someone else? Are you out of your mind?" Zachary lowered his voice, cold and flat, like a man finalizing a deal. "Relax. I'm doing it for the money. That house, that money flow. That's what we need." Marley shot back immediately. "So what? You're just going to take their money and disappear?" Zachary let out a short, mocking laugh. "Not planning to. I will. I just need about a year. 1 year, pull out the Caldwell money, pay off Greco, and then I'm gone. You and the kid just keep quiet. I'll handle it." Marley's voice tightened, almost breaking. "And what about the girl waiting for you at the church?" Zachary didn't hesitate for even a second. "She's just a stepping stone. The wedding unlocks everything. After that, I walk away." Lying there under the blanket, it felt like my insides were being crushed. By then, I understood something that made my chest feel hollow. My daughter wasn't about to get married. She was about to sign her name into a trap, and that trap was worth the rest of her life. At first I thought that was the worst of it. Zachary had a wife and child, and he was marrying my daughter just to drain our money. But Martin hadn't brought me to Maple Street just to show me an affair. When Zachary went inside the house, Martin quietly unlocked the trunk, back seat so I could breathe. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a small stack of neatly folded papers and a screenshot printed on glossy photo paper. He leaned closer and whispered, his voice hard as steel. "You heard him say 3 months, right? That wasn't a honeymoon." He tapped the paper once. "That's the deadline to kill you." I looked down at the paper. It was a printed screenshot, something that read like a short contract note. A few lines jumped out immediately. Target: 3 months post-wedding. Make it look like an accident. Payment: $50,000. A chill ran straight through me. Martin pointed to the name in the contact line, the intermediary tied to the same Greco Zachary had just mentioned. Martin leaned closer and spoke through clenched teeth. "If you let that wedding happen quietly, 3 months later, you'll have an accident." In that moment it hit me. This was no longer about stopping a bad marriage. This was about saving a life. Martin looked straight at me and said bluntly, "You've got two choices. Storm in there and make a scene and probably die sooner. Or go inside, talk to Marley, and get more evidence." I stepped out of the car, my legs heavy like they were made of lead. Martin walked up and knocked on the door again. Marley opened it, her face still flushed from the argument she'd just had with Zachary. The moment she saw me, she went pale because she understood instantly. If I was standing here, the plan to keep everything hidden had just fallen apart. I didn't shout. I didn't accuse. I simply held out the paper Martin had given me and asked one question. "Do you know anything about this?" 3 months after the wedding. Make it look like an accident. 50,000. Marley stared at the page. Her eyes widened, and she began shaking her head over and over. "No, I only knew about the money. I swear, Zachary said he was marrying her to get the Caldwell money and pay off Greco. I didn't know he planned to kill you." She suddenly broke down crying and pointed inside the house. "I owe medical bills because Mia was born premature. Greco threatened to kill my whole family. I tried to warn your daughter. I swear I did, but Zachary blocked every message." I stood there in silence, because Marley wasn't the one holding the knife. She was someone trapped between crushing debt and a man willing to murder his future father-in-law for money. The moment she said, "Greco threatened us, and Zachary blocked the warnings," I understood something clearly. If I went back to the church alone, all I would have was a story. But if I wanted to save my daughter and put Zachary in a position where he couldn't talk his way out of it, I needed to bring something he couldn't deny. A witness, documents, evidence. Right there on the sidewalk, Martin laid out the plan. His voice was low, but every word was firm. Marley and little Mia had to come with us to the church. Not to cause chaos, but to face the truth head on. They would bring everything Marley had. Documents proving the marriage or address. Threatening messages. Anything connected to Greco. I slipped the 3-month contract into my jacket pocket like it was my lifeline. Martin called our family lawyer, Douglas Whitmore, and warned him about everything. He also contacted the police, asking them to position themselves quietly so Zachary wouldn't have a chance to run. On the drive back, I sat upright in the seat. My hands weren't shaking anymore, because now I wasn't going to the church to attend a wedding. I was going there to stop a crime. I had come to stop a fraud and maybe prevent a murder that would follow. When our car reached the church, the opening music had already begun. Guests filled the pews, smiling and chatting like this was the perfect day everyone had been waiting for. Zachary stood at the altar in a neatly pressed suit, looking calm and gentle, the picture of a dream groom. Then my daughter walked in, and my heart tightened. One more step, and she would be signing her life into a trap. I walked straight down the aisle toward the front and raised my hand. "Stop!" The entire church turned at once. Zachary's eyes widened. He forced a nervous smile, trying to smooth things over. "Sir, this isn't the time." I cut him off, my voice cold as stone. "No, this is exactly the time. Because you have a wife, you have a child, and you're marrying my daughter to get your hands on the Caldwell money." Then I turned toward the entrance and gave a small signal. Marley walked in, holding little Mia in her arms. The whole room fell silent, because the moment the little girl saw Zachary, she lit up and shouted clearly across the church, "Daddy!" Zachary's face drained of color. The moment Mia called out, "Daddy!" the entire church seemed to freeze. For a second, nobody moved. Zachary took half a step back, his eyes darting around the room, searching for a way out. Then he suddenly turned as if to rush down the steps, but Martin was already there. He stood in the aisle like a gatekeeper who had been waiting for that exact moment. I didn't give Zachary time to spin another lie. I pulled the paper from my jacket and handed the 3 months post-wedding accident, $50,000. Note straight to our family lawyer, Douglas Whitmore. who had been standing near the front. Then I pointed toward Marley. The witness is here. His legal wife is here. At that moment, the church doors swung open hard. 2 police officers walked in, followed by a plainclothes investigator. They moved straight toward Zachary and began reading the warrant aloud. Zachary tried one last desperate smile. Just a misunderstanding. But the sharp click of handcuffs cut straight through his performance. At the same time, noise erupted in the church foyer. Another man was being held back by Officers Greco, the one behind the debt and that ugly little contract. He must have been waiting outside for good news. But today there was only one kind of news. The game was over. After that day, nothing ended with hugs or soft music like in the movies. It began with statements, case files, and cold, hard numbers. Zachary was charged with multiple serious crimes: fraud, bigamy, conspiracy to steal assets, and his role in the plan to stage an accident 3 months after the wedding. In the end, he was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Greco, the man behind the threats and the promised $50,000 payment, was pulled into a much larger case once investigators uncovered the network around him. When the whole operation came to light, he received 30 years. Marley was granted some leniency because she cooperated with the investigation and because it became clear she had also been trapped by debt and threats. I paid for part of little Mia's medical bills not because I was forgiving everything, but because a child shouldn't have to pay the price for the mess adults create. Life rarely wraps up neatly after something like that, but at least the truth came out, and the people who thought they could ruin lives for money finally faced the consequences. She collapsed right there in the church. Everything she believed in, every promise, every dream she had built around that wedding shattered in a matter of minutes. But after months of therapy and more nights of crying than I could count, she finally came to understand something. I didn't ruin her wedding. I saved her from a trap that could have stolen her entire life, and very possibly my life as well.